My son-in-law had no idea that the real estate company he was running as CEO, the one he mentioned within the first 10 minutes of any conversation, belonged entirely to me. To Damien, I was just Bridget's father. A retired old man who wore the same paint-stained Carhartt jacket in every season, drove a dented Ford pickup that probably embarrassed him when I parked it in their driveway, and spent most of my time fixing things around a modest ranch home in Garland that he had once, within my earshot, described as charmingly depressing. He had decided what I was the first time he shook my hand, and he never reconsidered it. He believed I was a former construction foreman who had retired on a fixed income and the grace of Social Security. He was wrong on every point. One evening, his parents flew in from Scottsdale to celebrate his latest announcement, a $300 million mixed-use development project that he had been publicly crediting himself with designing, financing, and willing into existence through personal brilliance alone. He invited me to dinner. I accepted, because I wanted to see how they would treat a man they believed had nothing. They showed me everything I needed to know. Before the entrees arrived, Damien's father slid a cashier's check across the white tablecloth and explained, very calmly, exactly how much my absence was worth to their family. 40 minutes later, I was standing on a cold Dallas sidewalk, making a phone call that would begin the process of dismantling everything they had built. Before I go any further, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And hit the like button if you believe that quiet patience is the most devastating thing a person can carry. My name is Arlo Finch. I am 67 years old. I built Pinnacle Development Group from a tool belt and a beat-up work van over the course of 3 decades, turning one small residential remodel contract into a company that now has active projects in 6 states and employs over 800 people. When my wife, Caroline, died from an aggressive cancer 14 years ago, I stepped back from the public face of everything. The grief almost destroyed me. Our daughter, Bridget, was 22, newly out of college, and I poured what was left of me into making sure she had a life built on solid ground, not one defined by a name on a corporate tower or a trust fund that could attract the wrong kind of attention. I restructured the company under a blind trust, removed my name from every public-facing document, and handed operational authority to my longtime corporate attorney, a man named Corbett, who had been my legal backbone since the years when I was doing my own bookkeeping at a folding table in my garage. The board of directors managed day-to-day operations. I kept 71% majority control through the trust. To the outside world, the founder of Pinnacle Development Group had quietly retired into irrelevance. 3 years ago, the board brought in a new chief executive, Damien. Sharp suits, aggressive resume, an effortless ability to absorb other people's work and present it as vision. He walked into the corner office on the 41st floor and redecorated immediately. He replaced a framed photograph of the original crew. 12 guys in hard hats standing in front of our first finished commercial building, with a large canvas print of himself at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. When Bridget introduced us at a family dinner shortly after they started dating, he looked at my calloused hands and my second-hand boots and formed a conclusion about me that never wavered. He was polite, barely, the kind of polite that is actually contempt wearing a sport coat. I did not correct his assumptions. I wanted Bridget to be loved for exactly who she was, not for whatever might be sitting quietly behind her name. And I needed to understand what kind of man she was building a life with before I showed him anything at all. So I watched, I waited. I kept wearing the Carhartt jacket. The dinner invitation came on a Wednesday. Norton and Adeline had flown in from Scottsdale, and Damien had arranged a reservation at one of those uptown steakhouses, with a marble valet stand and a menu without prices. I drove there in my truck and parked 4 blocks away on purpose. Norton was a large man who carried himself like someone who had never been seriously challenged. Blazer over a pressed Oxford shirt, heavy gold watch, a handshake calculated to establish the hierarchy before anyone had said a word. Adeline had a fixed, appraising smile she deployed the way some people deploy perfume, continuously and in every direction. When I walked into the private dining room, neither of them stood up. Damien gestured me toward the seat at the far end of the table, as far from the center of the conversation as the room allowed. I ordered water with lemon. I listened. The first 20 minutes were a polished performance of social obliteration. Norton talked about the Scottsdale house, the renovation, the square footage, the travertine they'd had shipped from a yard outside Tucson. He mentioned a river cruise they had just returned from. Portugal, private wine tour included. Adeline asked me, with enormous warmth, whether I ever got to travel much. When I told her I was thinking about driving up to the Ozarks to see an old friend, she made a sound that was almost a laugh. Norton asked what I had done for a living. I told him the truth. I said I'd spent my career in construction and real estate. He nodded slowly, filing it under a category he'd already created. Trades work, he said, not unkindly but not kindly. Honest way to spend a life. He said it the way you'd compliment a child's drawing. Adeline leaned in to tell me that the Dallas area had wonderful retirement communities. She had a friend whose father lived in one near Lake Ray Hubbard and absolutely loved the activities program. She offered this information with the sincere helpfulness of someone giving directions to someone who is lost. Damien sat through all of it without once redirecting the conversation. He looked vaguely uncomfortable, the way people look when something slightly unpleasant is happening, but not unpleasant enough to require action. He checked his phone. He refilled his bourbon. Then Norton reached into the breast pocket of his blazer and placed a white envelope flat on the table between the bread basket and my water glass. He said he was going to be straight with me, because I seemed like a man who appreciated plain talk. There was a cashier's check inside, $25,000. He said they had discussed it as a family. He said Damien was at a pivotal point in his career, that the circles he was moving in required a consistent image, and that he paused and chose the word carefully. Circumstances created friction that was becoming difficult to manage. He suggested I consider a retirement community. He mentioned Sarasota, Florida specifically. He said the climate would suit me, and the money would cover the transition. He said all of this evenly, the way a man speaks when he has delivered this kind of offer before and found it effective. I looked at Damien. My son-in-law, the man who had stood at the front of a church 3 years ago and made promises to my daughter in front of everyone who loved her. He held my eyes for about 2 seconds before he looked at his hands. He said quietly that he agreed with his parents. That perception mattered at his level. That having a father-in-law who looked like a day laborer, those were his words, was an image problem he couldn't keep managing around. I looked at the envelope for a long moment. I picked it up and put it in my jacket pocket. Norton reached for his steak knife. Adeline exhaled. Damien's shoulders dropped a half-inch in relief. They thought they had just solved something. I told them I wasn't feeling well and needed to step out. I said to tell Bridget I'd call her in the morning. I set my napkin on the table, stood up, and walked out of that private room and through the warm, crowded restaurant and out into the November air. I stood on the sidewalk. My spine straightened. The act was over. I called Corbett from the parking area 2 blocks away. I didn't say hello. I told him that my son-in-law had just paid me to disappear from my daughter's life, using a check drawn on a Scottsdale bank, and that his parents had been present and participating. I told him it was time to open the books. Corbett's voice went quiet in the specific way I had learned over 30 years, the quiet of a man who has just shifted into a mode that looks like stillness and is actually insurrection. He said he would have a team assembled by morning. I drove home. The forensic audit took 72 hours. Corbett retained 4 independent financial investigators and gave them complete access to every account that touched Pinnacle Development Group under Damien's executive authority. They set up in a secured conference room on McKinney Avenue, screens running, coffee going cold in paper cups. I was there for most of it. What they found was not subtle. For nearly 2 years, Damien had been running a fraudulent subcontractor billing operation. He had created 4 shell companies, fictitious specialty vendors, that invoiced Pinnacle for services never performed, waterproofing inspections on sites that were still in permitting, engineering consultations dated after project closeout. The amounts were carefully sized to fall beneath automatic audit triggers. The invoices were approved with co-signatures forged from department heads who had never seen the documents. The funds left Pinnacle's accounts, moved through the shells, and arrived in a private account in Damien's name at a bank in Nevada. Over 22 months, $2.3 million. Then the lead investigator, a precise, unshowy woman named Octavia who worked in pencil and never raised her voice, followed the secondary trail. She set a spreadsheet in front of me on the second evening and waited while I read it. Norton and Adeline had received wire transfers totaling $480,000 from one of the shell companies over the same period. The transfers were categorized as consulting fees for a firm registered in Arizona under Adeline's maiden name, a firm with no employees, no clients, no documented work product of any kind. The river cruise, the Scottsdale renovation, a car registered to Norton 8 months prior. All of it ran through one more layer of documentation back to money that had left my company's accounts. I sat with that for a while. They had used funds stolen from Pinnacle, from the payroll, from the project reserves, from accounts I had built with 30 years of honest calculation to pay for the life they described so proudly at that dinner table, and then they had looked me in the face and told me I was the problem. They had offered me money that, traced back 2 steps, came from my own treasury. I told Octavia to lock the files. Then I called Corbett and told him to prepare the second phase. Damien came to my house on a Thursday afternoon with a leather portfolio and the demeanor of a man who had already written the ending. He walked past the welcome mat. He stood in the middle of my living room, looked at the photographs of Bridget on the mantel like he was assessing inventory, and snapped the portfolio open on my coffee table. 3 documents. A non-disclosure agreement with language designed to seal every conversation that had occurred between our families. A voluntary disengagement statement by which I was to formally commit to no contact with Bridget without his written consent. And a release of inheritance claims, specifically targeting the investment account Caroline had set aside for Bridget years before we had any real money. A $40,000 safety net meant to be there if the world ever turned against her. He told me to sign them. He said the $25,000 would be followed by an additional $15,000 upon receipt of the documents. He said it with the flat efficiency of a man closing a deal. I asked what happened if I didn't. He told me, without raising his voice, that he managed Bridget's access to every shared financial account. He said he could make my relationship with my daughter functionally impossible. He said it the way someone states a policy, not a threat, as though it were simply information about how things worked. I went to the kitchen and found a ballpoint pen from the junk drawer. I came back. I signed all 3 documents, slowly, calmly, with a steady hand. Damien collected the papers before the ink was dry. He slid them into the portfolio, clicked it shut. He told me he appreciated my cooperation. He said one more thing. He was hosting the official groundbreaking ceremony for the Halcyon District project that Saturday. Press, city officials, the full event. He told me, with complete composure, that if I came anywhere near that venue, his security team had instructions to have me removed. I thanked him for coming by. I walked him to the door. What Damien didn't understand was what he had just handed me. 3 documents signed under coercion, without legal counsel, by a principal owner against his own company's chief executive. Corbett had walked me through the Texas statutes 2 days earlier. The portfolio Damien drove away with was not a legal instrument that bound me. It was a signed confession of extortion, with my name on it as the witness. Bridget arrived at my door after 10 that night. She had been crying for a while before she came. I could tell by the way she moved, carefully, like someone managing pain they've agreed to carry quietly. Damien had frozen every joint account. Her card had declined at the grocery store checkout. She had tried 3 cards. She called him from the parking lot. He told her it was a lesson in financial discipline. He said it was temporary. His voice said otherwise. Then he had come home with more paperwork. He wanted her to sign over her mother's account. Caroline's account, the one she had set aside in the years before any of us had much of anything, framing it as collateral for a bridge loan on a property acquisition. When Bridget asked to read the documents, he raised his voice. He told her she was ungrateful. He told her the marriage was functionally over if she couldn't trust his judgment. I sat across from her at the same kitchen table where I had helped her with geometry homework and watched her open her college acceptance letter. I watched her hands around the mug, her mother's hands, same way of holding the fingers, and I felt the full architecture of the past 2 weeks fall into place. I told her she was not going back to that house. I told her not to sign anything he brought her. I told her to leave his calls unanswered until I said otherwise. She looked at me the way she had looked at me once before, the night after Caroline's funeral, when she was too exhausted for pride. She asked quietly what we were going to do. I told her that by the end of the week, Damien would not be in any position to threaten her or anyone else. She didn't ask me how. She rested her head against my shoulder for a moment, the way she did when she was small. I thought about the kind of man who looks at something like that, a daughter who still leans on her father and sees only a leverage point. After she fell asleep, I made my calls. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Halcyon District project was held on a clear Saturday morning. White tents, catered breakfast, a row of color-coordinated hard hats for the dignitaries. A local television crew was set up stage left. The deputy mayor was scheduled to speak. Damien's publicist had written remarks describing him as a visionary, and appeared to mean it sincerely. I arrived 40 minutes early. I drove my truck, but this time I parked it close. I wore a charcoal wool suit I had kept in a cedar closet for 10 years. The last suit I'd commissioned before I stepped away from the public face of the company. I had shined my shoes that morning. Dark tie, no pocket square. I carried a leather folder under my arm. Corbett met me at the tent entrance. He had spent the previous 2 days coordinating with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit out of the Dallas field office. The investigators had reviewed our complete forensic package and issued federal warrants the night before. 4 agents in plain clothes were already positioned around the perimeter, indistinguishable from event staff. We walked in together. Damien saw me from across the tent before I was 20 steps inside. He was mid-conversation with the deputy mayor, his hand on the man's arm, doing the thing he did where he laughs slightly before the punchline to indicate he finds himself charming. The laugh didn't stop immediately when his eyes found me. Then it did. His face went through confusion, recognition, irritation, and then the specific fear of a man understanding all at once that he has badly misjudged a situation. He excused himself. He crossed the tent quickly, his smile held in place by willpower. He said very quietly that I had been explicitly told to stay away, that he had signed documentation from me, that one word to his team, and I would be removed from the premises and charged with trespassing. I said, "Go ahead." He hesitated. He looked at Corbett standing next to me. Something in him began to register that the scenario he had prepared for was not the one that was occurring. Corbett stepped forward and introduced himself to 2 board members who had come to stand nearby, not as legal counsel in the ordinary sense, but as the executive trustee of the entity holding 71% controlling interest in Pinnacle Development Group. He said it quietly, with no theater, just the information, placed where it needed to be. The chairman of the board, a man named Burke who had been with the company since the early years, and who had recognized me the moment I walked in, took a visible step backward. Damien looked at Burke. He looked at Corbett. He looked at me. He said this had to be some kind of mistake. I told him it wasn't. Corbett approached the event coordinator and requested the microphone. The ceremony was already running behind schedule. The coordinator, uncertain what was happening, but certain that something significant was, handed it over without question. Corbett addressed the audience briefly. He informed them that under emergency provisions, in the Pinnacle Development Group corporate charter, the majority shareholder was formally invoking his right to address the board and assembled stakeholders. He said that for the first time in a decade, the company's founder had come out of private life to speak directly to the people who had built this organization. He handed the microphone to me. The tent went quiet enough that I could hear the November wind pressing against the canvas walls. I didn't speak loudly. I never have needed to. I said I was grateful to see so many people who had contributed to building Pinnacle and to this project. I said I was proud of the work done by our architects, our planners, our project managers, and crews. Then I opened the leather folder and I told the assembled board, investors, city officials, and television camera exactly what their chief executive officer had been doing for the past 22 months. I named the shell companies. I walked the board through the wire transfer documentation, printed, annotated, flagged, and identified the specific invoices bearing forged co-signatures from department heads who had never authorized them. I stated the total clearly, $2.3 million. I noted that a portion of those funds had been directed to accounts held by the CEO's parents, through a fictitious consulting arrangement registered under a family name in Arizona. The television camera was still running. Damien tried twice to reach the microphone. The first time, Corbett stepped into his path. The second time, a federal agent materialized from the perimeter and positioned himself between Damien and the stage. Damien turned to the crowd and said the documents were fabricated. He said I was a bitter old man with a personal grievance. He said it loudly, with one eye on the camera, and I watched the confidence leave his face as he realized the camera wasn't helping. The lead FBI agent stepped forward. He identified himself. He addressed Damien by full name and informed him that on the basis of federal warrants issued the previous evening, he was placing him under arrest on charges of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy. The handcuffs made a sound in that quiet tent that I expect I will carry for the rest of my life. Norton and Adeline were seated in the front row of folding chairs. Two agents came to them from the sides. They were polite about it. They were not offering options. Adeline pressed her hand to her mouth. Norton stood as if he intended to argue, then seemed to understand all at once that there was nothing left to argue with. They were escorted out together, Damien first, then his parents, moving toward a morning that would be the last ordinary one any of them would experience for a very long time. Bridget was standing near the back of the tent. I had asked her to be there. She had watched the whole thing from a careful distance, and when I came down from the stage, she met me halfway across the floor. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at my face the way you look at something you thought you understood and are only now actually seeing. She said, "I didn't know." I told her I know you didn't. That was the intention, not to hide things from her, but to make sure the world couldn't use her as a way to reach me. I told her I had gotten the balance wrong, that my silence had given Damien room he shouldn't have had, and that I was sorry for the years she had spent in that marriage, not knowing what she was standing beside. She took my hand. We stood in the middle of that tent while the federal agents finished their work, and the morning light came through the canvas, and I thought about Caroline, who would have had very precise things to say about all of this, most of them involving language she saved for when she was certain Bridget was out of earshot. The federal case resolved in 7 months. Damien accepted a plea agreement on reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation and asset disclosure. He was sentenced to 8 years in a federal correctional facility in West Texas. His attorneys characterized the sentence as unexpectedly severe. I did not find it unexpected. Asset forfeiture recovered the shell company funds, the Nevada accounts, and nearly everything Norton and Adeline had accumulated over the prior 2 years. Their Scottsdale home was auctioned by the federal marshal's office. Norton's car was seized. The Arizona consulting firm was dissolved by court order, and every dollar traceable to its accounts was returned to the trust. Their social world, which had been constructed almost entirely on the appearance of wealth rather than the substance of it, collapsed with comparable speed. The country club suspended Norton's membership pending the federal proceedings and never reinstated it. The dinner invitations stopped. The people who had been their friends turned out to have been, more precisely, their audience. I don't spend time thinking about them. Bridget used part of her divorce settlement to go back to school, nursing, which she had wanted to study years ago before Damien convinced her the hours would interfere with his schedule. She has an apartment in Richardson, 15 minutes from my house. She comes over on Sunday mornings when neither of us has anywhere pressing to be, and we drink coffee on the back porch and watch the neighbors walk their dogs and talk about things that have nothing to do with any of this. I remain the majority shareholder of Pinnacle Development Group. The board brought on a new chief executive who spent her first week on the job asking the team questions rather than issuing directives. I take that as a good sign. Corbett manages the trust with the same careful precision he has maintained for 30 years, and I remain involved without being visible, which is exactly where I am most comfortable. The charcoal suit is back in the cedar closet. The good flannel is on the hook by the back door, next to the one with dried paint on the left sleeve. I never built this company because I needed people to know what I was worth. I built it because the work was real, and it was mine. And I wanted my daughter to grow up understanding that something honest and lasting could come from someone willing to do the hard part first, and let the recognition come later, if it came at all. What Damien and his parents never grasped, and what I think is the one thing genuinely worth carrying out of all of this, is that arrogance runs on a clock. It doesn't usually fail in one dramatic moment. It fails the way a foundation fails. Quietly, from the inside, one small crack at a time, until one morning the whole structure comes down, and the people who were standing in it can't understand what happened, because they spent so much time admiring the view they forgot to check the ground. I have always checked the ground. That is where the actual work gets done, and that is where I have always been most at home.